My name is Katharine. I am 29 years old and I am currently a psychologist working in addiction. I think I've worked in addiction for a number of years and I've always been interested in policy and the discrepancy between the aims of policy and actually what's happening, and this war on drugs and the government's drug strategy at the moment isn't working, and unless we look at other ways, we're going to carry on in this downward spiral that we're in at the moment. I think it's really important for people to question and challenge, and with the David Nutt incident recently, I think a lot of professionals and especially scientists, practitioners, people who rely on evidence and scientific research to inform their practice, became quite disillusioned with how much that's not happening in addiction and drug policy. For my master's in substance misuse, so it's an academic paper, and it was essentially looking at current UK drug policy and trying to analyse what was currently wrong with it, because we know it's not working. And I chose to focus on the idea of the myth of the addict, which is this sort of concept that policy at the moment is based around this mythical person. You know, you don't need to go far to see it. It's on, you know, in the tabloid newspapers. It's Pete Doherty. It's you know, the characters in Train Spotting. It's this idea, excuse me, idea that drug users are criminals. They're usually sort of good kids gone bad. That once they start using drugs, that the only route is down, really, and that they become criminals to fund drug use. That they do anything really to get a drug, and then eventually their life leads to death usually. And I think policy at the moment is really based on this mythical figure, specifically with regards to crime. Current UK drug policy is really focused on a link between drug use and criminal activity. It's, you know, it's just assumed that this happens, and this is the case. And whilst there is evidence to show that drug users do engage in some criminal activity, actually correlation cannot be seen as causation. I mean, it's the earliest thing you learn in scientific research. Just because two things correlate does not mean that there's a causal link. And I think actually if you look in more detail at the research, you see that criminal activity tends to precede drug use and not vice versa. That actually drug users tend to only do quite a small amount of drug-related crime, or crime related to seeking drugs. And actually a lot of the people who are in prison for criminal activity, that's usually related to actually taking drugs and possessing drugs. So, you know, there is a criminal element that is inextricably linked with drug use, but saying that using drugs causes people to become these sort of vicious criminals, I don't think is necessarily the case. But at the moment, policy is based around this assumption. Most treatment is directed towards criminals, and we don't know if that's actually true. So it seems a shame to kind of tarnish everyone with the same brush and say that this is the treatment style that we're going for, when it seems to be missing out a lot of people. The current place that I work is a specialist service for people who misuse mostly Class A drugs. So it's not particularly a service for alcohol users. So it'd be people who are dependent on drugs like heroin, crack cocaine, but also on prescription medication, so benzodiazepines, for example, or strong over-the-counter pain medication, things containing codeine, for example, and then quite often a mixture of all of those drugs. Most people are referred to the team via their GP. It's usually, they can be self-referred, and they can also be referred by outreach services. So really we have quite a big spectrum of people coming from different areas. You have to have some form of dependency on a drug that warrants help from the NHS. So a dependency on heroin, for example, and you would be referred to the service for maintenance on methadone. I think a dependency for my service would be someone who is experiencing significant psychological dependency or problems associated with their drug use, physiological addiction to a drug, so suffering physiological withdrawal, say to an opiate, and maybe also experiencing lifestyle difficulties as a result of their drug use, so unemployment, homelessness, and becoming quite socially isolated as well, usually. So general problems at many levels associated with their drug use. The service that I work in is a multidisciplinary team, so they would generally offer someone an initial assessment with a psychiatrist who specialises in addiction. If they needed to be detoxed off any medication or put onto a maintenance prescription, so methadone is an example, or buprenorphine, a drug like that, then that would be started. A urine sort of toxology screen would be taken for that to be started. A person would then get a key worker or a care coordinator, someone who would be in charge of a treatment plan for them, and they would be given support around sort of managing their drug use. They would be regularly checked, their urine would be checked for drug use. They'd be offered groups to attend, so a relapse prevention group. I think we have a starting treatment group, so preparation for change group. So a variety of different options. And if a person felt that they wanted a referral to a psychologist, then that's when someone like myself would become involved, and we would assess the person for psychological therapy. Quite often people with addiction problems struggle to see psychologists because there's a general attitude within psychology that intervention with people who are currently using drugs is not really worthwhile, that the person needs to be drug-free for usually at least 2 years to be able to see a psychotherapist, for example. So it can be quite tough for people to see a psychologist, but in the team I work in, that is possible. You would initially go and see your GP. So the first step is to talk to your GP about any problems you might be experiencing, or talk to, say, an outreach worker that might meet you in the street. When that happens, you would come along to the hospital where you would be seen by a doctor and a nurse, and what they would want to do is talk to you about your drug use, how much you're using, when you're using. They would look at an average week with you, so they'd talk you through the last week and ask you how many drugs you were using on what days. And then they would take a urine sample and they would look to see what drugs are in your urine, so that they can be sure that the drugs you say you're using are actually there, because sometimes people can think they're using certain drugs and actually not be using as much as they think they are. Once they've taken that, they usually take that twice to make sure. Then you would be started on a script, as it's usually referred to, so a prescription of methadone if you needed it. If you didn't, then you wouldn't be started on that. But if you were having any problems with your mental health, so if you're feeling depressed or anxious, then you might be started on medication to help you with that. Then the team would really be there to help you stop using drugs in whatever way they could. So that could be talking to you about your drug use, finding ways that they could support you to maybe get a house, to join some groups, to talk to other people about your experiences and see what helped them, and maybe that could help you. And then if you were feeling like you wanted to talk to someone a bit more in depth and a bit more privately, then you could see a psychologist, and they would be someone who you could talk to about that sort of thing. Basically, if you're not a criminal, then trying to get into rehab or somewhere like that is nearly impossible. The priority is given to them. So, you know, a lot of the people that I work with that don't have a criminal record would maybe find it harder to access treatment. You know, whereas if you get arrested, the speed with which you have access to services is incredible. You know, you just are fast-tracked, really. You know, and I think fast-tracking everyone into treatment is a good thing, but to prioritise people who are addicted to drugs and engaged in criminal activity maybe is a little bit unfair. I mean, especially if you think about treatment, the one thing we know about treatment is that people have to be ready for treatment for it to be effective. So if you're coercing people into treatment when they maybe aren't ready, you know, you're essentially wasting quite a lot of money on people who aren't ready to change, when there are people who maybe are, who would need that treatment more. People who are using drugs but aren't addicted to them, I mean, I suppose they're missed quite a lot, aren't they? Because they don't become known to services. If they do, they might become known because they get caught with drugs, and so instantly they get put into this criminal box of a sort of the classical mythical drug user. You know, research really misses them out because they aren't the people who are recruited for academic research into drug use, and so I think they're this completely missed population. We don't really know anything about them, you know, and the fear of being tarnished with this brush of being an addict, you know, keeps people in the closet, I think, a little bit. You know, if your choice is to, you know, come out as a drug user and be seen by society as a criminal, or keep that secret, you know, which one would you choose? But if we don't learn more about these sorts of people, then we're never going to have an evidence-based idea of what's going on with drug use. Drug use is particularly complicated for research because it's very rare to find someone who just uses one drug. So ecstasy, for example, there's a lot of research going on with ecstasy at the moment and the potential risks that are coming out. And I'd say that ecstasy using population are probably some of the people that are missed because they're not sort of having problems because of their drug use. But when we try and do research with these people, they tend to have used other drugs before. So to get an idea of actually what effect these drugs have is very difficult because you've got other drugs in the mix and you're never sure which one is having the causal effect. I think researchers are doing as much as they can. I mean, I know there is research into all sorts of drugs at the moment. I'm not sure if the research is focusing on a mixture of people. So opiate research tends to focus on, you know, people who are dependent on heroin, and it would be very rare for research to focus on someone who used heroin maybe once or twice in the last year, or, you know, once a month and is managing to maintain that. They wouldn't be included in the research usually. I think ecstasy, there is a little bit more research going on with that. You know, but again, it's just difficult to get access to people who will freely admit to using drugs. You know, there is this suspiciousness about admitting to this, even if you are given anonymity. People are scared about talking about it. I think I was drawn to addiction. I had quite a sort of liberal upbringing with regards to attitudes about drugs. I also grew up in a family where there was addiction, specifically to alcohol. So, you know, I could see that it wasn't just the illegal drugs that had the potential to cause harm, and that legal ones could do that too. And at the same time, the illegal ones could cause even more harm. So I think my initial interest was kind of in alcohol, and then that spread to other drugs of abuse. And I think once you get involved in addiction, it just sort of sucks you in a little bit, because it is just a fascinating, ever-changing subject. You would never get bored talking about addiction, because it's constantly evolving. And there is such a complexity to it, because each drug is different. The route of administration of drugs is different. The impact that it has on people is different. Nothing is ever constant in addiction. The simplest explanation is if you choose the drug over everything else. So an easy way to sort of spot, say, alcohol addiction would be that instead of choosing to go out with your friends, you would maybe choose to stay in and drink by yourself. And maybe that the hangovers start kicking in and you can't go to work. So the drug, in this case alcohol, becomes more important than everything else, than socialising, than employment, and eventually, as the spiral continues, becomes more important than physical care, housing, paying bills, that kind of thing. So I don't think it's necessarily one thing, addiction. I see it as a kind of a line, I suppose, a spectrum that you can be placed upon. The idea of addiction as a spectrum is quite useful because you know, everyone is going to have a different idea of when addiction became a problem for them. And so in AA they talk about this thing called the rock bottom, which is when you reach that point where you realise you have a problem. You know, whether that's you lose your family, you lose your job, you lose your home, that something happens that says, hang on, what I'm doing is not right, and I need to change what I'm doing. But for everyone, that rock bottom will be different. You know, for one person it may be simply a relationship ending, a marriage coming to an end. For other people, you know, that I've worked with, they've lost limbs because of injecting drug use, and yet they still continue to use drugs. So it will really be a personal thing that will be people's rock bottom. I suppose in psychology quite often we look at problems in this sort of quite complex model, and it's called the biopsychosocial model, and it will look at biological aspects, psychological aspects and social aspects, and I think that really is a useful way to think about addiction. Biologically, drugs are addictive, and I mean all drugs. You know, your morning cup of coffee, the glass of wine at the end of the day, and the injecting heroin user. They will have an impact on you biologically, and the brain doesn't distinguish between legal and illegal drugs. It never has, and it never will, really. So I think from that sense, as a psychologist, you can't distinguish between legal and illegal. What you look at is the reasons that someone is using a drug. So that would be the psychological aspect of the model. There are many different theories about why people use and abuse drugs. I mean, theories of attachment and problems in the relationship with the primary caregiver in childhood, and drugs becoming a sort of an artificial object that people become attached to, is one. A self-medication hypothesis that people use drugs to treat themselves for psychological deficiencies, so to speak. So alcohol and anxiety is a classic example. You feel anxious when you're at a party and you have a drink to kind of relax you a little bit. So psychologically, again, you can't really distinguish between different drugs. In that sense, it's about medicating oneself. I suppose psychologically there is an element of excitement around illicit drugs that maybe doesn't exist around legal ones. I know that a lot of people I work with talk about being fearful of the straight life, so this sort of quite boring, drug-free, crime-free, potentially, world. And then there's the bio-psycho and then the social aspect. So that will be someone's social environment, maybe the modelling that they experience of whether drugs are good or bad, if their friendship circle is made up of people who use drugs. But also I think the social aspect of a lot of people who come, we know from research that people who come from economically deprived areas are more likely to use drugs and find them addictive. Studies with monkeys have shown that monkeys who are lower down the social sort of hierarchy are more likely to abuse cocaine. So there's something about, you know, your social status in society that predisposes you to finding drugs addictive, and you know, the abuse potential increases there. So I think to simply classify it by what's legal and what's illegal, it is far too simplistic, because we have so many levels that this is working on. I mean, what we know from sort of brain research is that there are specific reward pathways in the brain, and an area called the mesocorticolimbic dopamine system. So when you use drugs, dopamine is released in the nucleus accumbens, and this happens. This reward pathway, I think, is sort of implicated in other reward behaviours. So eating food, having sex, those sorts of things. We need a pleasure pathway in our brain for us to carry on doing these important behaviours. What happens with drugs is that this pathway is activated. And what we've found, or what researchers found I should say, is that drugs have a potential to continue activating this pathway. So where if you ate a bar of chocolate, for example, the pathway would initially be activated and then it would get used to the chocolate and you would eventually not find it so rewarding. So the first bite of the cupcake is always the nicest. With drugs that are abused, what happens is that pathway continues to be activated, so it doesn't show the same decline that other things do. I mean, we also know more about having specific receptors in the brain, so we know now that there are specific opiate receptors in the brain. We know that there are cannabinoid receptors, and we know that there are nicotine receptors that exist naturally. So the brain is not distinguishing in any way between what is legal and illegal. We are naturally designed to respond to these drugs. It would be impossible for us not to find these enjoyable and pleasurable at a certain stage. I mean, once other things kick in, then the reward pathways change a little bit, but initially they are hedonistic and we are designed to enjoy them. Essentially, alcohol on its own is toxic to the liver. Cocaine on its own is toxic to the liver and also dangerous to the heart. You know, it's a stimulant. It increases the heart rate. Put them together, and the damage is double, essentially. And this substance, cocoethanol, that's created is so damaging, you know, to the liver. And so much more. And I suppose the danger is that the more cocaine you take, cocaine has the opposite effect to alcohol. So alcohol is a depressant on the body. It slows down the heart rate, it slows down your breathing, it relaxes you. Cocaine is a stimulant. It increases your heart rate, increases your breathing, and it makes you want to stay awake and be alert. So if you combine the two, using cocaine allows you to continue using alcohol for longer. Without cocaine, alcohol use would eventually cause people to pass out, fall asleep. So not only is the substance more toxic, but it also allows you to carry on using more alcohol, which then becomes more toxic.
And that doesn't mean they're balancing each other so that you're actually fine because you were slowed down or speeded up.
I think theoretically, I mean, the body is designed to try and regulate itself. I think what tends to happen when you combine drugs like that is you get the roller coaster effect, that instead of sort of having this nice line, the body's going like this and it doesn't know which way to turn. I mean, that's why we get withdrawal effects, is because the body naturally wants to bring us back to a kind of neutral line and natural and our sort of normal way of functioning. So with alcohol, if you're taking alcohol and you have this depressant effect, the body increases the heart rate to compensate for that. When you stop taking the drug, it takes a while for the body to realise that, so you continue with the effect, the counteractive effect. So that's why getting the shakes after you've been drinking, getting the sweats and heart palpitations is essentially your body trying to counteract the effects of alcohol. We know it's not working. Drug use is on the increase. More and more young people are using drugs. What we need is an evidence-based policy. And until that happens, we're not going to have anything that works. Luckily, there is a lot of research that's going on, and people are spending, you know, vast amounts of time trying to solve this problem, and looking at ways that they can help. But that's being ignored, and what's happening, because this myth of the addict, the myth of the addict exists, it's so easy for the government to base policy on that, because we have something called heuristics and the availability heuristic, which we as people work with. So flying is a great example of the availability heuristic. Most people are more scared of death from flying than they are from crossing the road. And that's because it's much easier for us to draw up images of a plane crashing, because we see it so much in films and things, than the sort of more mundane crossing the road accident. with drugs, the myth of the addict is so easily brought to mind. It's in the media all the time. It's, you know, in our newspapers, the link between crime and addiction is presented to us on a daily basis. So for the government, it becomes this really easy, simple solution to such a complex problem. You know, either we tackle this problem realistically using evidence and it gets complicated, or we continue using this simplistic version of a myth of an addict that has easy solutions. You know, education, let's tell people that drugs will kill them. That'll work. You know, let's make drugs illegal. You know, these are morally corrupt people. If we continue down that pathway, you know, we're only going to be working, you know, and the policy is only going to be aimed at such a small minority of people. If we actually look at the evidence, it's opening Pandora's box. And I know that, and most people know that. But until we actually do that, we're not going to have a policy that is addressing the real issue. You know, so many people say education works, you know, let's teach our young children not to use drugs, when the research shows us that it doesn't. DARE in America, this huge big project designed to stop people using drugs, showed no long-term comparable effects when compared with a control group. Most education is actually really propaganda. We're trying to force our children not to use drugs, and that is never going to work. And they talk about this boomerang effect, and you see it in things that initially seem quite logical. Tell people that cigarettes kill them, put posters up showing lung cancer and how awful it is. All that does is make a smoker want to smoke more. The natural physiological response is, I feel stressed, therefore what is my coping mechanism? I'll smoke. You know, so as good as the intentions are and as logical as it may seem, unless we look at evidence, we're not going to be getting the effects that we want. We're going to be getting counteractive effects, and we're going to be wasting a lot of money on huge big marketing campaigns that have absolutely no effect. I mean, I think it makes some really good points. It talks about, you know, the harms of drug use not just being about the drug, but also the illegal nature of illicit drugs and drug dealers, you know, going to dark alleyways to purchase drugs, never knowing what's in drugs, you know, is part of the danger. Heroin is cut with so much these days, you know, cocaine is mixed with all sorts. At the moment we have a problem with anthrax in heroin. You know, this is seriously dangerous stuff we're talking about because there is no regulation. So I can see that is a good suggestion and has many potential benefits. At the same time, you know, I currently work in a service where we are maintaining people and prescribing people drugs such as methadone to support them. And what happens is that because people are such experts in their own bodies, they feel that they maybe want a different type of drug, more of a certain type of drug. When services are prescribing dangerous drugs, the issue of risk becomes very important. We live in a risk-averse society. You know, all mental health professionals know how important risk assessments are, the priority. We don't want people to hurt themselves, and when you're giving out dangerous drugs, the likelihood of risk is high. So professionals would have to protect themselves and wouldn't be able to give out how much drugs people wanted to use. They would have to regulate that, and as a result people might not agree with how many drugs they're being given or the quantities or the dosage. So an illicit market is still encouraged because people will continue to seek drugs elsewhere. Methadone at the moment, there's prescribed methadone and there's a black market for methadone for people who want to use it without a prescription. They don't want to come into a service with psychiatrists and doctors and be told how much to use. They want to decide themselves. We can't, as professionals, always let that happen because the risk is too high. You know, when you're talking about opiate-based drugs and combining it with other drugs, this is, you know, like handing someone a shotgun. You know, it's dangerous stuff and it has the potential to kill. So I don't know if the solution is that simple. The problem is that government advisors are just advisors. The government doesn't have to listen to the advice that they give. But what is the point of having a specialist who does research into something to completely ignore the advice that they give. And I think it sent a really strong message to scientists, especially in this area, that their research is not valued, that we will continue basing policy on things that get us a vote. And I think as researchers, I suppose this is maybe a point that I want to get across, you know, when you're doing research, you want research to be unbiased and ethically sound. And I think within drug and alcohol and tobacco research, there has been a very strong history of alcohol-funded research, so the Portman Group funding research, for example, and when outcomes don't represent what they want us to know, that they aren't published, that we aren't made aware of this. And you know, the alcohol industry has so much lying on people believing that a small amount of alcohol is good for us, and that it's these morally corrupt people who aren't able to control their drinking that have the problem. Alcohol is a poison. You know, it has the potential to harm, I'd say, more than most other drugs. You know, you can actually die from alcohol withdrawal. How many people know that? You know, cannabis, for example, it's impossible to die from an overdose of cannabis. You know, it can't actually stop you from breathing. Alcohol, I could probably go to the Tesco's round the corner and buy enough alcohol with £20 to kill myself. And I think this is starting to emerge a little bit about this idea of the middle-class female drinker, that we've sort of come to believe that it is the morally corrupt and minority that abuse alcohol. I think a lot more people than that are abusing it, and we're really starting to see the effects of that.
How?
Well, I think the government is starting to kind of catch on to this idea of, you know, the couple that shares a bottle of wine every evening with dinner, and that kind of thing. So we're starting to become aware that it isn't just these small minority of people, that actually having a drug, alcohol, that is available to so many people causes death and harm, and to constantly put it on a minority is dangerous, and it's not helpful in any way. And with the David Nutt incident recently, I think a lot of professionals and especially scientists, practitioners, people who rely on evidence and scientific research to inform their practice, became quite disillusioned with how much that's not happening in addiction and drug policy. For my master's in substance misuse, so it was an academic paper, and it was essentially looking at current UK drug policy and trying to analyse what was currently wrong with it, because we know it's not working. My name is Katharine May. I am 29 years old, and I am currently a psychologist working in addiction. I think I've worked in addiction for a number of years, and I've always been interested in policy and the discrepancy between the aims of policy and actually what's happening, and this war on drugs and the government's drug strategy at the moment isn't working, and unless we look at other ways, we're going to carry on in this downward spiral that we're in at the moment. I think it's really important for people to question and challenge, and I chose to focus on the idea of the myth of the addict, which is this sort of concept that policy at the moment is based around this mythical person. You know, you don't need to go far to see it. It's on, you know, in the tabloid newspapers. It's Pete Doherty. It's you know, the characters in Trainspotting. It's this idea, excuse me, idea that drug users are criminals. They're usually sort of good kids gone bad. That once they start using drugs, that the only route is down, really, and that they become criminals to fund drug use. In scientific research, just because two things correlate does not mean that there's a causal link. And I think actually if you look in more detail at the research, you see that criminal activity tends to precede drug use and not vice versa. That actually drug users tend to only do quite a small amount of drug-related crime or crime related to seeking drugs. And actually a lot of the people who are in prison for criminal activity, that's usually related to actually taking drugs and possessing drugs. So, you know, there is a criminal element that is inextricably linked, that they that they do anything really to get a drug, and then eventually their life leads to death usually. And I think policy at the moment is really based on this mythical figure, specifically with regards to crime. Current UK drug policy is really, really focused on a link between drug use and criminal activity. It's, you know, it's just assumed that this happens, and this is the case. And whilst there is evidence to show that drug users do engage in some criminal activity, actually correlation cannot be seen as causation. I mean, it's the earliest thing you learn